This is from a TikTok live broadcast I did recently where I compared the difference between an index fund and exchange traded fund. Also explain what the hell's going on with inflation in New Zealand. It's at 5.9% now, and the difference between projections and judgments and why you need that for better mental health. So let's kick into it.
So you're walking along, you come into the office and you've got that boss. He's just selfish. They just keep talking to you like, they're just all about themselves. They don't give a fuck about me. Like those guys, just selfish. And then you can feel that emotion. Whereas someone else, they might be acting a little bit selfish, and doing things for themselves, but they're a good friend and it doesn't really impact you the same way. And then you start digging into it. It's like, why do I have such a strong emotional reaction to this person? And the good sequence that we use at a group that I go called the Mankind Project, which is like a meeting we do every week. We talk about our feelings, and it's a structured way to actually assess and develop our psyche. So the process that they use when you have a projection, the first point of call is the judgment. So what do you judge? What is fair? What do you sort of judge this person to be, but you're not really sure if it's the truth, but you just have a judgment call on that. The next piece is you move around in terms of assessing this experience, because you're feeling the charge, like the person's not even there. So the boss that's selfish, that's impacting you, isn't even here anymore, but they're impacting your mind. And you're like, oh, this person's living in my head rent-free. And so you really want to start working on that and assessing that, because the person's done the bad action, but they're still hurting you even when they're not there. And that's a voluntary choice. You're choosing either unconsciously or consciously to ruminate on those sensations. So the next point of call is data. So imagine you're standing in court, standing hand on Bible, whatever the hand you want to put your hand on, whatever hand you want to put your hand on, I'm good with words. So they're like, okay, I want the truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God. And you stand in front of court and you say, okay, here is the data that suggests that this person's selfish, or data that justifies the emotions that I have. Indisputable data. No emotions, no projections, just like they did this, they did that, data. So you do the judgments, you do the data, and then you do the projections, the emotions, because the emotions is what happens. So either in your past, you've carried it through, or you have some emotions that need to be expressed, and by you expressing them to a person that's not judging you and is accepting you, you teach those emotions that it's okay. So once you express it, you let it out, you get all the anger, the projections, you don't know if it's true, and you just let it out with someone that you trust that's going to hold the space. Then after that, you start thinking, who does this person remind me of? Whether it's a small trait or a big trait, there's someone in your life potentially that had a huge impact that you saw as selfish, whether it's your parents, whether it's your siblings, whether it's someone you went to school with, whether it's your teachers that said you're stupid and you could never make it, and you just built that identity yourself. Just think of that. Assess, who in my life does this person remind me of? And then when you start unraveling it, you're like, wow, sure, the boss that I have can be selfish. Sure, the people in my life hurt me. But the emotion that I have is so strong and so powerful, you got to ask yourself, what about me makes me feel that way? And then you start assessing, what traits from that person have I taken on? Because when you're learning, when you're young and you're forming your identity, your sense of self, you often model the behaviors of the people around you. Show me your friends, I'll show you your future, that old saying. So you actually have, the people in your life have a huge impact on the way that you think. And you start modeling that behavior. You might not want to. It might be a small part of you, who you are, but it's really hard to admit it. But the reality is you have similar traits, or are likely to have similar traits than what you experienced. Or potentially you adopted opposite traits, so you become very selfless and very nice, but then you keep giving and no one wants to give it back, and you get frustrated and upset, and like you present yourself as a very selfless, caring person, but deep down you have a yearning to fulfill the self, the part that you haven't had fulfillment over because you acted against the person that hurt you. So the person hurt you, you took on a role that took up the opposite to not cause drama, or you started mirroring and modeling their behavior and hated that so much about yourself that you judge others instead of admitting, hey, I have this attribute. So it's an important thing to make between projections and judgments. And I think it's something we do now. Like if you think about the political side of things, also welcome. Hello. Gabby's saying hello. Hello, Gabby. So if you think about that sort of process in life, who am I projecting on? Okay, they may do bad things. They may be bad people. They may have truth to the feelings that you have towards them, but the emotions you have are yours. So if you think about that, where are you doing projections? Where are you implementing that in your life? Or where is society doing that? So a good example might be Russia and Ukraine. You know, there's a huge sort of whose side should you be on, or Democratic or Republican. And you have a strong emotional reaction to people not in your group or not holding the traits that you expect. And sure, they may do good or bad things, but it's your emotions that we're focused on, because you might not like to forgive them for the actions that they've done, but you might want to forgive them for you. You know, forgiving them for you in the sense that they've done a bad thing, had a bad impact on your life, but they're no longer in your life. Or maybe they are, but every time you're away from them, it's as though they're still there. You're having these ruminating thoughts, these like repetition of the experience, living it over and over and over again, and you're like, I can't get this person out of my head. And that's where it's about forgiveness and understanding the triggers that lead to you thinking that way. What do we got here? Questions. Do you think the markets have been healthy post-COVID crash? It's been doing parabolic for 2 years. It's a Friday knockoff work. Yeah, eventually I will, mate. I'm just conscious that there's a certain point in my life where I can make a big impact and build a significant business and don't have to worry about family. So I'm happy to make that sacrifice. What I'll have fun. I'll enjoy myself. So just to talk about on a completely unrelated note from what I was discussing, what is the markets really like with COVID? So the thing you need to realize about COVID is basically it's an artificial market. There's unprecedented stimulus, unprecedented printing of money. They call it something called quantitative easing, where they swap some numbers around and it makes it seem like we've got more digital money, give it to the banks, yada, yada, yada. Now we've got more money in the circulation, or maybe they just print more. So in America, they printed 40% of all the money ever printed in the last year. They're pumping out the stimulus. Joe Biden's got this idea of like, we're going to do this $1 trillion stimulus package and we're going to change the world. And that's injecting an artificial economy. And then the thing about it is with COVID, it's a legitimate threat to businesses, but aside from lockdown, we're doing okay. But then we got the stimulus. We got people that can't travel, spending too much. We got supply chain issues where you can't get things in and out of the country in an easy way. And you got migration, so people aren't coming in and offering a good workforce and offering opportunities, so wages become more competitive. So people have this money from stimulus. They have businesses that should be closed that are not closed because the inland revenue are letting them go, like letting them get away with it, but normally they'd be insolvent. Yeah, you can keep operating irrespective of whether you're a good business before COVID. We'll let you keep going. So it's an artificial economy. A lot of insolvency lawyers have had their work completely dry up. When you would think at a period like this, a lot of businesses are struggling. So the thing with COVID is artificial economy propped up by stimulus and low interest rates. People have been spending like mad, and now the roosters are coming home to roost because interest rates are flipping up. Interest rates are increasing. And then the other thing is you got limited access to workers, so you're going to have to pay them more. The other thing is supply chain issues, so your overheads are higher. And then you got the interest rates where you can't even service the debt potentially. So the Reserve Bank and central banks of the world need to do something about inflation, but that could be the very thing that tips the economy over the edge for a period of time. So I would say it's uncertain. No one knows what's going to happen. The government seemed to not necessarily have a clear plan moving forward, which leads to insecurity and fear, which makes the markets wobbly. You can't predict the future. There's areas of concern, but if you've got a diversified portfolio, you're not relying on individual companies, you're going to be fine. You just got to survive through the ups and downs and make sure it's geared to your opportunities in life. So, are you recording these lives and posting them somewhere? Yes, brother, we're going to be on a podcast. This will probably be the only one that I'm going to post because I didn't get the audio all set up properly for the other ones. But this will be on the podcast. Will inflation get under control this year? Man, I really wish. I'm just going to ignore the other comment, but thank you. I can't win with these pants. So for the podcast listeners, basically, I have an issue where I wear tight pants and it seems to attract certain types of people or certain interests. And I don't necessarily want that. But we just keep moving on because I like the pants and, life is life. So anyway, so inflation, the tricky thing is you don't have a crystal ball. How can you know what the future is going to hold? Inflation's at such a substantial point. In America, it's 77%. In Turkey, it's crazy. In Argentina, it's crazy. In New Zealand, it's 4.9%, arguably 6%. And then the housing market isn't actually included in inflation. So you've got a certain basket of goods that aren't being included. They aren't necessarily reflecting it. You've also got supply cost and businesses struggling. So even just organic vegetables or just vegetables in general went up by 19, 20%. So the beast is out of the cage. The challenge is the government also has $60-odd billion from the annual budget set aside to help people with COVID. And what they keep doing is either using the traffic light system and supporting businesses that struggle, or they potentially go into another lockdown and they got to support that and driving more money into an economy that might not necessarily have that money. And then when they come out of that, they spend, they enjoy, and then the economy recovers. So I think inflation is going to be a continued problem for the next year at least. Or they do drastic increases of the official cash rate, spiking interest rates up. The economy has a huge impact on the economy. And then maybe there's a quick reversal of inflation out of scarcity and fear. But I suspect that's unlikely to happen because they have that COVID policy anyways. It's a great time to negotiate a higher wage with your bosses, people. Yes, it is. Anyone that's looking to negotiate with their boss and their boss is struggling to get staff, there's also certain uncertainty about their future and being able to support their businesses, so they don't necessarily want too much change, so it's a good chance to negotiate. And one of the most powerful things you can have in negotiation is the ability to say no, and then understand what the boss motivates the boss or the decision maker with the wage, because a lot of people discuss numbers, whereas it's actually quite intrinsic. There's things that you can add that aren't material that will make the boss more incentivized to pay you more. When property seems dodgy with rising interest rates, the thing about property is it's just like a good business. It's not necessarily dodgy if you run it right. A lot of people I've heard of just buying property like e-commerce. They click a button, they've got a house now, they never looked at it, they're going to be in trouble. There's a lot of challenges. Interest deductibility has been wiped out for rental property owners apart from commercial and a few other things. There's more protection for tenants, so rent increases, kicking them out. There's a lot of overheads that are going to be tough for property owners. So the important distinction isn't the compliance risk or where the market's at. It's actually if you enjoy it and you're passionate and you can run it effectively. I feel like we need a major correction. I don't see another solution, unfortunately. I don't think anyone's complaining about the pants. Love your honesty, though. Okay, brother, we'll move on. We won't comment on it anymore. But I think the reality is, if there isn't a correction, then it continues on greed, and then there's an artificial representation of the market. Ben Graham was a famous value investor. I'm not sure the specific quote, but he says, investing in the short term is a voting machine, in the long term, it's a weighing machine. By that is people trying to assess the value of a company, and it's a vote, and it's not necessarily reflected on the value of the company, and it fluctuates over the short to medium term until the real companies are still there over the long term. So what happens if you don't have a correction is people get overconfident, they go on their sharesies in the hatch and they're making 20% a week or 20% a month or a year or whatever it is. They get overconfident in their ability, they have a hindsight bias where they look back positively can't even say positively, look favorably on the past, even though it's not necessarily a fair representation of the future, and overestimate their ability. Also look for patterns in the random. They try and find a pattern where there is no pattern, because that's how we make sense of life as humans and cut corners with the brain. So at some point there's a market correction, and you need it if you don't have any consequences. Like even with prison, people think the severity of the consequences of their action is more important than actually the frequency of which they're caught, but that's not true. If you actually want a society that's more efficient, more productive, and less bad things happen, you need to increase the rate of which people are caught. That course corrects them. It means they don't get too much of an identity, too much of a habit. It's a lot easier to turn them in the right direction. So with investors, they're going nuts. They're overestimating their ability. They haven't experienced a significant market correction for a period of time, or long periods of time. And they're overestimating their ability, so there needs to be consequences for that. What else we got? New Zealand made mistake relying on housing for two-thirds of its wealth, non-productive asset. How should we measure inflation in our economy? Whoa, two big things. Yeah, I mean, people invest in property thinking it was the same as what it was for their grandparents or their parents. And it's so common, people talk about land and they talk about having money in the bank. This concept of investing, people's perception around investing is that it's bad because they've seen people lose money, but they're not investing in a way that's diversified, that's going to protect the capital of their money. So that's the problem is, we just blindly follow without education, without understanding, like who teaches finance in schools? I'm trying to build an online learning platform. We try to go through the schools. The bureaucracy is fucking impossible. So instead of actually going through the schools, we're going to attract the audience to us so that we can have less people making mistakes. So moneyskills.co.nz, it's in the early stages. Judge me, help me make it better. But that's the goal, free online learning for everyone. In terms of what should be measured for inflation, I mean, there's some benefit of having a systemized approach that can be transferable to the past. I think consumer price index is still a fair representation of how things are going, but you still got to have a subsidiary overview of how things are going. And you don't necessarily want the Reserve Bank to have too much power to influence and to make changes, or the government, because it's very hard to have the foresight to think ahead. Like if you're a leader and you're trying to influence people, you're much better off to get them inspired and responsible for their own outcomes in their life than it is to have compliance and force them. So it's like education over regulation. So the risk you have is if you expand the measurements of which the Reserve Bank uses their mandate and assess and adjust to help maintain that mandate, then they might get an overstep their mark and cause more harm than good. So as much as consumer price index doesn't necessarily reflect real inflation across the board, it's still good as a measure for historic inflation to see how they're comparing, and doesn't lead the Reserve Bank down a misery road of trying to do too much for too many people. Housing investing in 2022 reminds me of Bitcoin investors. They think it will still rocket up 1,000%. Yeah, that's the sad thing in life. I mean, people don't have the opportunity to go through the ups and downs. Like people talk about Warren Buffett a lot. And the best thing about Warren Buffett isn't necessarily his knowledge, it's his emotional fortitude. His willingness to read 8 hours every day just for the off chance he finds one company in his lifetime. Maybe 3 to 4, and he's expanded his team so they can pick more. But he talked about you can only usually pick 3 to 4 great companies in your lifetime, and that will give you everything that you need. Now, I don't necessarily agree because potentially a lot of people don't necessarily have the talent to execute on that, and he was also a business owner. So when he would buy a company, he'd say to them, hey, we're in it for the long run. We're not here to run your business. We're just here to provide you the funding and the support that you need. So that's a distinction between investors on Sharesies and Hatch thinking like, yo, I've got it all worked out. I know how to do it, yada, yada, yada. So that's what happens is if there's a historic performance, people get FOMO, a fear of missing out. and like, shit, I got to get on this boat. As soon as they get on the boat, they don't know how to skip a ship. They don't know how to navigate the rough seas, and they might not even thought of their own personal situation having a significant change like it did. So that is a concern. So what's the difference between exchange-traded funds and managed funds? So basically, an exchange-traded fund, for the most part, is usually a single asset class. A single asset class, an example might be commodity, there might be gold ETF, it might be property, it might be shares, it might be bonds, it might be cash. There's lots of different exchange-traded funds. What makes an exchange-traded fund different is it's a coupon that represents an underlying investment. That underlying investment, it has a sponsor that goes out and buys the real investments, and then there's usually a bit of lag between the two, between what people are paying and what the underlying asset's worth. And the concern is, if everyone tries to leave all at once, will it be able to handle it? So far it has been able to, but the main concern for me is it's a single asset class. Not a bad idea if you go on shares and you can handle your money going up and down by 40 to 50%. Very volatile. You've got a time horizon over 12 years. Not a bad idea. A managed fund, the main point of difference, the ones I'm talking about, are usually called growth, balanced, or conservative funds. They have 4 different asset classes, usually which are cash, bonds, property, and shares. That has a low correlation to each other. So one does well, the other one does bad. One does well, the other one does bad, or they all do well at the same time. Gives you the flexibility to access the money at different times. So the market might have gone down significantly, but portions of your funds are accessible and can be adjusted to achieve a certain outcome. If you've got an exchange-traded fund, a single asset class like shares, you've got to leave it for at least 12 years because the market could tank for 4 to 6. At least for the managed fund, it's less likely to have such a significant drop. You can access if you need it, and you can gear it towards a certain time horizon. So that's the main distinction between an exchange-traded fund and a managed fund. What are your pronouns? I've never been asked that. He, him? Is it he, him? Yep. Just got to know. No worries. Great question, Gosly Speed. Yeah, I've actually got 1% of my podcast list is a non-binary, which is cool. Whatever. Like, my whole perception is if people are patient with me, like if they say, hey, Ryan, can you please address me in this way? And I'll be like, yeah, cool. Like, I know of a person called Jewel of the Universe, and someone's telling me a story. Telling me a story where they basically had this person, they're working, they're a successful surgeon. It's very easy to find them now. But they're abducted by aliens, which could be true, it's possible. And they like to be called Jewel of the Universe. And I'll call them Jewel of the Universe. The only thing I'll say with pronouns is I've kind of gotten used to it over 30 odd years, calling people by he and her. So I'm going to fuck up. So if you're patient, I'll try. If I fuck up, be understanding, please, That's for the whole pronoun thing. Okay. The opportunities part talked about wiping tax from KiwiSaver. I didn't know it was tax. Yeah, KiwiSaver's tax at a prescribed investor rate, which is capped at 28% or 17.5% or 10.5%. It can be 0, but in rare cases, like a charitable trust or something like that. So KiwiSaver is taxed on the income portion, which would be dividends in the investment, the interest rate you get on bonds, that sort of thing. So things that can be perceived as income, but if the capital growth increases, capital appreciation, like a house increasing in price, or shares increasing in price, that's not taxed. If my 64-year-old mum is planning to pull her KiwiSaver out soon to spend on a forever home, would you set it as a cash fund now? Well, that's tricky. It depends what the market is doing at the moment because it's basically tagged. It's not a bad idea. Like if the market's okay, she's going to consolidate her investment in 1 year. This is tricky because I need to give you disclosure statements to do this. So I won't talk specifically about your situation, but let's say you're looking to take out all your KiwiSaver in 1 year and the markets haven't tanked, it's a good decision to put in cash because it's not volatile, and you need to be making sure that that's the decision you're actually making. So yeah, the concern though is like, what if the markets have gone down 10%? That person's crystallizing that loss. So maybe they should have a little bit of flexibility in terms of when they're going to buy their home. The other concern might be, okay, they're 65, they're going to buy a forever home, but how are they going to fund their lifestyle? So super, if they're not together, is about $20,000 after tax. You've got to work out where the rest of that's going. So maybe they might be better off not buying a house so they can fund their lifestyle. So last questions, team. We're at the 1 minute mark. Kia ora, bro. Do you invest in shares? I only invest in managed funds, my brother. Does tax add value to flat money? Fiat money? No, that's in the question. Do managed funds actually outperform passive? No, for the most part, passively managed index funds for shares outperform most fund providers. It's just that in a lot of people's situation, financial understanding, emotional fortitude isn't necessarily geared towards an index fund. That's why we don't recommend it much. But usually a passively managed index fund outperforms most fund managers. So on that note, I've got to wrap it up, team. So thank you for your time.